kick it off. It's top of the hour, and we may have a handful of additional people join us too as we get going, which is great. So welcome to Negotiating Collaborative Agreements, what to expect when partnering with large companies. I'm Jeff Steinley. I'm a partner at Frederickson & Byron, and we'll do intros in just a bit. I thought I'd set the stage for this talk a little bit. Most small companies who I talk to, clients and non-clients, I always start the conversation with, what's your plan? What's your strategy? What do you hope to do? And the answer that I often get is, well, we'd really like to exit and choose your number of years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. And then they add, but of course we're building the company to last. And, we are prepared to go it alone if that's the direction that this takes us, which is a very good answer, of course. But what this talk is going to address is a lot of times you can almost do better when you do neither of those kind of two different binary options. That there are partnering transactions with large companies that can end up being very beneficial to the startup company and why you might want to do that. And in fact, sometimes doing these partnering companies will help accelerate your growth or accelerate your ability to exit, if that's the strategic direction you want to go, or alternatively to continue to build your company because you're partnering with a large player. The background of this talk is Medtronic asked us at Frederickson to do an in-house training several months ago as they are looking at putting more strategic importance on some of these types of collaborative arrangements. And so a number of us gave a training. And as this came up, I thought it would be great to bring some of our Medtronic colleagues onto the stage with us and just give some perspective on what big companies think about when they're partnering with small companies. So Medtronic is an example. So we might nerd out a little bit on medical technology as we give this presentation. All four of us are lawyers. We might also nerd out a little bit on some of the legal minutiae as we go through. But the main point of this conversation is just to give you some more perspective of what a big company thinks and kind of how they view of partnering with small companies, some watch outs, and then just to give you an idea of kind of the strategic importance of these types of relationships, for your company. So we'll go around and do introductions. Anne, why don't you start, and then we can go Rona, Aleda, and I'll conclude.
Sounds great. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Ann Ladd. I'm a shareholder at Frederickson & Byron, where I practice in the life science area and the data and technology area. That means I focus a lot on helping people commercialize their bright ideas, commercialize their products, and oftentimes that involves working together with other companies to do that, bringing additional resources to the table for early stage companies who are looking for ways to sort of accelerate that commercialization pathway. Over to Rona.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rona Schwade. Thanks for being here with us today. I'm an in-house attorney at Medtronic. I've been at Medtronic for almost 6 years. Right now, I support our business development team. And what that means is I help work on M&A transactions, but also all sorts of business development, commercial agreements, some of which we'll be covering here today. So I'm happy to be here. Nice to meet you.
And I'm Aleda Connors. I am also in-house counsel at Medtronic on Rona's team. And so we work on the same things. I've been at Medtronic for 3 months, so short period here. But before this, I was in private practice, also working in M&A and then working with startups.
And I'm Jeff Steinley. So from a legal perspective, I serve as outside general counsel to companies. I also negotiate commercial agreements and spend a good deal of time doing mergers and acquisitions as well. and then generally support companies in their corporate governance efforts. From an industry focus, I chair a life sciences group and do virtually all of my work in the medical technology world. So it's kind of the world that we live in and breathe in. I was previously in-house at Medtronic. Both Rona and Aleda didn't mention it. They're both previously Frederickson lawyers. So all of us have worked together on these type of arrangements for a long time. I remember when I first joined Medtronic, Ann and I were doing a really fun project that got us some ribs in Memphis. I remember a really kind of complicated, tissue stapling project with Rona when she was an associate at Frederickson. So we've been doing this together for a long time. So the agenda today, we're going to go through 4 types of collaborative arrangements. We'll talk about product development agreements, patent and technology licenses, data sharing arrangements, and a variety of sales arrangements. Collaborative arrangements generally, the context that these are is, really complex ongoing obligations between the large company and the early stage company. There are usually funding mechanisms between the two of them. There are licensing issues and IP issues that kind of go through most of these types of relationships. And there's a big people component to it as well, because you're really partnering together, you're really working together with your counterpart at the large company as you're proceeding on this initiative. But they can be complicated. The cartoon here, and these are living, breathing agreements, so we as lawyers do the agreement, but again, this is complicated and it's based on people and it's based on technology, which can be uncertain. So these change over time as well. So it's kind of the legal parameters and the relationship pieces are all, very, very important because things will continue to change as you go, just like it was for poor Michelangelo in this cartoon. On this one, I thought it'd be helpful. We can just kind of, have, Aleda and Rona talk a little bit about, why big companies want to do this instead of either, if it's as an example, a development agreement, doing the work in-house, or alternatively, why don't they just buy the company if they want the IP or something else that the company has? So Aleda and Rona, I kind of take it away and give some perspective from the big company perspective.
Okay, I'll start a little. Well, thanks, Jeff. I think, there can be a variety of different reasons for wanting to get into a relationship with a startup company or a small company. In the beginning, it might just be to prove the concept, to see if the startup company's idea works and how well does it work, and if there are synergies between the two companies that make sense for a greater partnership or potentially an acquisition down the road. Sometimes it's that the startup company brings expertise and technical know-how that we don't have in-house, and so we want to work together to develop together. Sometimes it's a budgetary issue. It may be that a business doesn't have the budget to do the R&D itself or the dollars to buy the company outright, but can find something in between that advances the technology and both parties' objectives short of an acquisition. On the commercial side, it may be that the startup company or the smaller company has access to customers or a patient base that we don't, or vice versa. We have ability to commercialize in markets or in ways that the startup doesn't. And so that there's synergy there to partner. So there can be all sorts of flavors of things of why we want to partner together. And sometimes they lead to acquisition and sometimes they don't.
Thanks, Ron. Aleda, anything to add?
No, I think that covers the positives pretty well. Then on the risk side, once we partner, come into these collaborations, you do enable the startup to have exposure into your IP and know-how, et cetera. And so it can make the long-term more expensive if they're learning from us. So there are certainly risks to it from our perspective as well.
That's probably maybe, Jeff, is that a good segue into a conversation about why these can be so complicated?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great segue.
Yeah. I mean, partly I think about this as, there's all times we're negotiating a relationship. And if you're negotiating an acquisition, you sort of have a point in time and then you separate and you go your separate ways. Or if it's, a product distribution agreement, which we'll talk about, usually that at least means there's a product that's developed so you know what you're dealing with and you can set the framework for your relationship, even though it's ongoing. With some of these development agreements, license agreements, you're trying to negotiate this ongoing relationship at a point in time when you're not really sure what all the things in the relationship are going to look like yet. And so you have to do a lot of what-ifing in these conversations about where the product is going to go. What happens if things don't go? We can do all the planning we want about what the development timeline looks like or what we're hoping to accomplish. But what if it doesn't happen that way, or it's much better? What if there are intervening IP rights? And the fact that we're dealing with intangible assets often just does make this a more complicated conversation. And we'll talk about some of the specific IP issues when we talk about the license as an example, collaboration relationship. But that's always one of the things I think it's worth bearing in mind in these unique collaborations, because trying to get access to IP in a different way, but it just makes it more complicated. And it makes you have to focus on some other topics, like how you slice and dice those, the access to that IP, which might be territory-based, geography-based, field-based, etc. Mention geographic considerations. Oftentimes you're thinking about working together in one geography but not another, and that can create some interesting conversations around what happens in the areas where you're not working together. And sometimes, whether you intended to start that way or not, you end up having to collaborate with someone that you might think of as a competitor. So from a big company's perspective, that's always something we're thinking about when dealing with an emerging company, because we don't know where they're going to go in their growth scenario. So there are sort of aspects of that and making sure we don't run across any competitive restrictions that we have to take into account. And then in the world that the four of us spend a lot of time in, there just are complex regulatory aspects to all of these relationships that we have to bear in mind from the get-go. So if we're talking about a product that requires FDA or similar clearance, maybe we're talking about data and the FTC might be playing a role that we have to think about. There may be Medicare or Medicaid reimbursement, and we need to understand the rules of the road there, and some of the other health law restrictions that may impact our ability to market or develop a product. So just, again, a complex world, especially in the healthcare setting, but any setting where you're, collaborating to come up with something new and then decide how you're getting it to market, just gives a background that it's always important to have in mind as you move forward.
And particularly on the regulatory overlay, I mean, this cuts across a variety of industries. For example, if you're doing a transaction with a foreign company, a statute called CFIUS comes into effect that really impacts a broader cross-section of our software companies, just based on cybersecurity concerns and exporting, what could be strategic software outside of the US, and deals with China have certainly been scrutinized a lot. And then the other thing to think about is these can be small deals, but in a way you are also taking a potential competitor of the large company off the market. So there are some antitrust considerations as well as you do that. The geographic area, I'll give you one example from my day yesterday. New client has a potential part, university licensed IPs, building a startup around, has a partner in China who is willing to fund the company, in this case through clinical trials, and all the company in China wants is entire Chinese rights. So our conversation is, it's like, okay, well, what about the other potential buyers of you down the road if you can sell everything in the world other than China, which obviously is a huge market. Just to kind of add to the complication, these aren't standalone. So you kind of want to think about these in the universe of like the broader, chessboard of agreements that, that they have. Sometimes we'll do a standalone development agreement. I'm sure a lot of you outsource, development yourselves, for software or the like, or a standalone sales agreement or distribution agreement. Often they're a combination. There's a license, there could be, distribution in one country that's exclusive, non-exclusive sales arrangements in a different country, combined with a license agreement or a development agreement or sequenced agreements. And then the other thing that we see a lot is structured acquisitions where there's funding from the large company to the small company, some strategic rights in the interim, such as a license or a distribution or sales agreement. But then ultimately the big company has the option at some triggering event in the future to buy the company if they so choose. So we see a lot of kind of complicated arrangements here as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about product development agreements, and then we'll kind of go through these various types of agreements. So product development agreements, the classic example, that startups see it when they hire a developer is that like you hire a developer, they do kind of captive development for you. You own everything that they have. It's a little bit different in the context of the relationship with a large company, because in that context, a lot of times the large company will look to the smaller company as a partner to do development work for something that the large company ultimately would like to sell or to buy. So the development work continues at the small company. The big company, might have some observation rights, but by and large, they're perhaps funding. They might have rights. They're not really involved in the development. The other thing we see a lot is more of a joint development program where the large company and the small company are working together. You're working at the in the lab or at the bench together to develop a new product, or sharing in software development. And then the last one is kind of joint development, but it's parallel development of two products that'll be used in combination. So in this context, think about like an app that is supportive of a broader electronic product. I'll use a Medtronic example, like Medtronic's diabetes therapy, for example. Where there could be an app that supports kind of the monitoring of the use of that of the insulin pump, but there's like an advancement in both that the app is being developed outside, and then Medtronic is kind of doing a parallel development of the app itself. So initial question for Aleda on this one: why not just do it? Why doesn't Medtronic just do it themselves? I mean, they have a huge R&D budget. They have a massive team of smart engineers and developers. Why do they partner with the small companies to do this?
Yeah, so I think we touched on some of the reasons we might do this a little bit earlier in the broader context, but for product development particularly, sometimes it can be budgetary concerns. And yes, it's a massive company with a large budget overall, but each of our operating units, each of the businesses has its own budget. And so it can look different for that business unit, whether they've got the R&D funds or not. And so outsourcing the development might be a good way to do that. There can be expertise reasons as well. You mentioned, Jeff, the app scenario, right? So we may have engineers in-house who are very good at developing the diabetes technology, but maybe not on the software side, or there might be some expertise that we don't have that the startup has, and so it makes sense to go that route. And then another pretty important one is I think startups can move a lot more nimbly and quickly than we can, and so as you might imagine with a large company, things don't happen and decisions don't get made as quickly as a startup will be able to do it. And so the time to develop gets cut short when you don't have to go through those extra hoops.
There's a couple of key components as we structure these agreements. Number one is the scope of the development that we're doing. We as lawyers spend a lot of time kind of working with the business teams and figuring out what this looks like. So that includes let's identify the scope of what we're working on, the product or the service that's being developed. This is really kind of a joint business and legal initiative. The other thing is really identifying and working through. It's all right, what is each party doing in this development process? What does it look like from a development, verification, validation, who's doing regulatory? Again, this is in a regulatory environment, and who's paying for each piece of this. And then the last is, exclusivity and termination rights. While we're doing this work, large companies' perspective is that they don't want you working with anybody else. They want to partner with you. So a lot of times we spend a lot of time really saying, here's the scope of what you're only going to work with the large company. And, and outside of that, you can work with a smaller company. But we really want to be partners with you exclusively in this one. And then the last one is kind of this futility measurement of, at what point do you just say, yeah, you know what, this isn't working, and we're going to, cut it off, and we're not going to, spend more money on it or provide additional capital for it. And that can be a really hard conversation for the smaller company because obviously, they'll have, smaller companies have a much, greater percentage of their eggs in a single basket. So Elena, another question for you. What stage does Medtronic like to jump in with companies? How early is too early? When do they like to jump in?
Yeah, that's pretty situation specific, but in general, there's got to be more than an idea, more than a concept, maybe some minimum amount of protected IP or clinical data, or maybe a product that's works but needs some more maybe tweaks to get it to work with a therapy that we have, for example. And so there needs to be something there that where we see a path to approval and a path to a product that's can be commercialized. Sometimes that means, you've got maybe something in development, but you need our expertise on regulatory and clinical help with that, right? And so we can partner and collaborate, but you've got something going. It's more than a concept.
Yeah. Okay.
One other thing I would add about that is, when you're working with a big company, they're going to expect to do some due diligence on your company, and you need to be prepared for that. They're going to want, depending on the deal that you're doing, if it's a potential acquisition, then it's going to be full-blown diligence, and they're going to want to look at everything. If it's just an investment or a smaller scale deal that's, let's say, development related or commercial, then it's going to be more streamlined, but you should be prepared. They're going to want to see your IP and what work you've done to protect your rights. They're going to want to see your technical data. They want to see that you have a quality system. They want to see your financials and perhaps audited financials. So before you get into a situation where you're negotiating with a large company, I would advise to make sure your own house is organized and you have your ducks in a row so that when you're asked to populate a data room with your diligence materials, you're ready to go.
It's a great point, Rona. The other thing that we spend a lot of time discussing in these product development agreements is milestones. So this is kind of the opposite of the futility discussion that I had before, but it's really kind of identifying different go forward triggers. Usually in the technical development of a product, these a lot of times will get put into a project work plan, but then also there will be funding. you accomplish X in your development agreement, and the large company will provide additional funding of $2 million as an example, or whatever the number is based on it. So there's tension in kind of identifying how you measure like the achievement of those milestones. And similarly, for regulatory approvals, from a payment perspective, put aside like funding of the development program. From a payment perspective, where the small company makes its money, again, defining what those milestones look like, whether it's regulatory approval in the medtech example, or some technical accomplishment, or or kind of uptick in the market. Like defining all of those are super important, and we spend a lot of time working on what that looks better. And probably no surprise, but it's better to negotiate those at the upfront, rather than kind of waiting down the road. Good to be specific, and really think about it in the context of the development plan. Rona, can you talk a little bit about, the development plan, or a project plan, or work plan, or whatever you call it? That seems like kind of this quasi-legal, businessy, technical agreement. Kind of what goes into that, and who leads that, and who works on it?
Yeah, sometimes this comes as a surprise to clients. So sometimes we'll have a request from an R&D engineer or a business development person, or both, and say, we need a contract. We're going to do this development deal with such and such partner. Can you help us? And of course, your lawyers can help you put a contract together that's going to say how much money is going to be paid and when, what the confidentiality obligations are, what the term is, how the parties can get out of it. But at some point, someone needs to actually say what the development work is going to be. And your lawyers don't know that. Unless they're super smart and engineers themselves, they probably can't explain the way you can what exactly the program is and what the plan is. So they will probably share an exhibit with you, or a services attachment or something like that, where you or your R&D folks, or whoever is going to be actually involved who understands the technology, who understands the aim of the development and what you're trying to accomplish, and have to reduce that into writing, like what each party is going to bring to the table, what the timelines are required, what the testing, if there's testing involved, what it needs to show. Like Jeff said, developing language, and your lawyers can help, but about milestones, like what do we have to see in this research to say, yes, this plan has been achieved or hasn't, and to really reduce it down to the technical specifications and responsibility that each party plays in executing that.
It's a great segue into like some of the governance that goes into it. So what Rona just described is this huge, people process, and it's kind of a translation of kind of technical objectives and into a written document, that it attaches to a legal document. There's this whole monitoring and kind of governance process that goes over the top of these agreements as well. A lot of times you'll see a joint steering committee with people involved in it. There's obligations to report up, review of data. A lot of detail goes into kind of this information sharing, during the development program. So Rona, another question for you. Can you talk a little bit about like the people side, like who's doing what here, as we do these development programs, and kind of what's the difference between like a project team and a joint steering committee, and like who are the people involved from a Medtronic perspective?
Yeah, so typically you would see in a development or research agreement, maybe a program manager, a representative of each party appointed, either they're named in the contract itself, or that the parties have communicated to each other that they are the point person for each of their organizations in executing this plan. And again, it will vary if the research is really only happening on one side or it's more collaborative. But those are the program managers. So in Medtronic, that program manager would be in charge of the team that's executing on the development work. And then they typically would report into what I think Jeff is referring to here is a joint steering committee or joint development committee, which might be a bigger committee where the program manager sits on, but also, maybe has another one or two people from Medtronic in our case, and the other company, 2 or 3 representatives from them. And their job is to, like Jeff said, they're not in the weeds in the everyday operation and execution of the development, but they're looking at it at a high level. Like, are we tracking to the timeline? What is the trajectory of the research? Is it going the way we thought? Are we going to meet our timelines? And they probably have relationships with their business and their greater organization, so to speak, to see, like, is this still a strategic priority for us? If it's going to take longer, are we still interested? If it's not going well, should we pivot? And so they sort of are the liaison between what's happening on the ground in the research and what's happening at the company, and managing that.
Then just quickly on this slide, we talked a little bit about funding and milestones and what this looks like. But Aleda, here's the question. I think I asked it before, but Medtronic is, they have lots of money. They can hire the best. I know you talked about it a little bit, but there's the why, but also the, like, who are they looking for? Like how does this help fill their gaps and right? And how do they think about using these dollars as they're funding it?
Yeah, the funding question comes down to, we mentioned each business has its own P&L, right? And so they're worried about the bottom line for that business. And so they're going to work with our finance and accounting functions to really understand how the development costs are going to be treated under GAAP and how they're going to hit that P&L. Generally, they're going to be pretty hesitant to do things that are going to cause dilution. And so viewing it from that lens, they're just trying to fund in a way that would be helpful to their P&L. And Jeff, maybe you can get a little bit more into the weeds on from your BD days, but that's the general gist there.
Yeah, as Aleda mentioned, I had a role in Medtronic in corporate development, and and there's a lot of focus and a lot of pressure on public companies to do something that is accretive or kind of adds to the earnings per share of the company overall. So that gets pushed down to each budget within most of those business units within Medtronic, and each one of those general managers is looking for ways, both to increase Medtronic's EPS as well as to hit their own targets, and make sure that they can grow, obviously, but they're not spending and having a year or a quarter even that's in the red. And I'm going to kick this one off to you, kind of maybe as a brief preview on kind of your talk later on licensing agreements. But can you talk a little bit about the IP and development agreements?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Jeff. So Rona mentioned that one of the things that you need to be ready for if you are going to partner with a large company in any kind of collaboration, and I'll focus on the development context here, is to be ready for diligence. And I'll put it another way. If you're going to work together with a large company, with anybody, and you're going to bring IP that you already have, that you think you already have in your bucket to the table, or the outcome of your work together is going to be development of IP, that really is going to be an area of focus in diligence and in the contract. And so just as a starting point, a reminder, if part of the benefit that you bring to the table in any of these conversations with someone with whom you're going to collaborate, make sure you've spent a little time doing your own pre-work to ensure that you actually do control the IP that you think you're bringing to the table. So maybe you're an early stage company and some of the invention was done before you were formed, or by people who don't technically have an employment agreement or haven't done a technical IP assignment, like maybe you as the founder. Get those things documented and put together so it's really clear that the company does control all the IP and there isn't a concern that there are lingering IP ownership issues with individuals. We've seen that example from time to time where someone had a friend who helped with some of the work and they hadn't worried about getting the assignment done, or just confusion about how IP ownership works. And just a reminder, the person who invents something or who comes up with code, who writes material, that, you know, the starting point is the person who does that invention or authors that work is the owner. Now, there are some exceptions there for people who are employed to invent or employed to do that kind of creative work. There might be things that sort of trump that underlying general rule, but generally you want to make sure that those individual rights have been assigned to a company in a written document. And when you've dealt with third-party researchers, maybe you've worked with a university, maybe there have been people on that team, maybe you've used an offshore resource. That's where that diligence really comes in, and people really want to drill down and make sure all the rights have been appropriately assigned. And then on the go forward, there's going to be a lot of conversation about how we deal with rights to new IP. And again, if you start with that starting point that the person who does the invention, a company that does the invention or authors the work, writes the code, owns it, then you can see why the contract needs to be really clear about what happens. So Big Co is going to know that it's not just enough that they paid for some of the development. They need to have things documented. And in a lot of these complex commercialization relationships, it may not be an all or nothing. Again, we may be thinking about things in fields. And so you can get into some complex situations where you're trying to define who owns the new IP, especially if it's joint IP. So there are inventors from each company, for instance. Who's going to own that? Who's going to have the right to commercialize it? Who's going to control the patent prosecution or pursuit of infringers? And sometimes we'll do that around a field. Sometimes we'll just rely on the common law rights that, you know, are going to follow the laws of inventorship. And sometimes it's just a question of sort of negotiating power, to be honest. So always going to be a conversation. There are perils of joint ownership that Big Co is going to want to avoid. And so again, if there's been a joint development, so an inventor from small company and an inventor from big company together have come up with something, the big company's not going to want to just rely on its rights to exploit that. It's going to want to have some clarity on not only freedom to exploit it itself, but also some limitations on what the other company can do. So going to want to control that. Otherwise, it can be a little bit of a Wild West. It can vary from country to country. The other thing that we want to address in all these collaboration relationships, but it comes up in product development, is not just the core intellectual property. So not just the patents and the copyrights and the trademarks, but some other rights that are often aligned or associated with that. So let's say we did some research and there was data that was gathered. Maybe there was some bench research. Maybe there was a clinical trial. Deciding who gets to use that data, who gets to publish that data, and how it's going to be protected is often a conversation area. And also, again, back to the regulatory approvals and the rights to reference regulatory filings is going to be one of those things that we also spend some time talking about. And Big Co is going to always come from the standpoint of wanting to make sure it has absolute freedom and knows that it has the ability to move forward without having questions down the road, and is going to want to make sure it understands and has clarity on what rights the other party has to, on its own, continue to use any of those assets or to work with a third party. So again, back to that, who are we dancing with? How does that change over time? And does that affect our thoughts about approach to use of data, for instance?
Thanks, Ann. And then just kind of to conclude on the discussion of development agreements, this one issue cuts across all of these agreements. So we'll kind of, talk about it as a bit of an interlude here. And it's the obligation to use commercially reasonable efforts, which on its face seems fairly benign, and you see it in a lot of contracts. And it just means that, like if you're selling a product, you're going to use commercially reasonable efforts to sell it. If you're in a joint development program, you're going to use commercially reasonable efforts, to, do your portion of the development program. So we see this clause all the time. We spend a lot of time talking about what commercially reasonable efforts or CRE means. And, Rona, can you kind of quickly explain, because this seems benign to me, why do large companies have heartburn over, agreeing to just use their commercially reasonable efforts?
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, it depends a little bit about the context in which, the efforts obligation is being asked to be applied to. But in general, it's when two parties are negotiating an agreement, the clients on, the parties on both sides, the individuals on both sides are typically very excited about the relationship. They think it's going to be a great success. They're very invested in it. But as we know, especially in a big company, over time, people change, priorities change, the market may have changed. There may be a new technology that you thought you're developing in one area, then you thought that was the right pathway, and then something happens and you realize like this really isn't the pathway we should be going on because things have changed now, or there's a better way to do this. And so it's just very hard to obligate yourself in the future to use a certain level of efforts towards a project. And I think it's also because, as you see in this slide, commercially reasonable efforts can mean different things to different people at different stages in a relationship. So if you're a startup company and you have one technology that all your energy is going into making that a priority, well, of course, you feel like you want that to be a success and that's your main focus. In a big company, there are many different projects. So what you think is commercially reasonable for the big company to be working on and investing in versus what the company's leadership thinks, it may be different things. And so it can lead to disputes down the road. Like, did you really do all that you could, Medtronic, or big company, and what big co can do versus what a small company can do, depending on, what the level of expertise they have or the commercial force or whatever, could be much different, and they may just have different expectations. So if we're going to go along this path, which is difficult to do for those reasons, one practice tip is to try to define what that means, what the expectations are if you're going to go down this path. But again, it's fraught with, it can lead to disputes. And so sometimes we'll say, we'll make you whole financially, but we can't promise we're going to do XYZ in the future because of all these uncertainties. Or, we'll promise that we're not going to do anything to purposely, and I think this is the catch-all clause you're referring to here, to intentionally avoid paying you a milestone or something in the future, but we can't promise this is going to be a success right now.
That's exactly right. Thanks, Rona. You've got kind of a quick hitter checklist that we use on these. I won't go through this in detail, but if you want to, send a chat, happy to, provide slide or send your contact information in the chat. Happy to send it over to you at the end of the presentation, and so my contact information will also be there as well. So, Ann, I'll turn it over to you and let you talk about patented technology licenses and sharing agreements.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So again, just setting the context a bit here, thought it might be helpful to talk about how these kinds of licenses may become relevant in these collaboration relationships. And the concepts that we're going to discuss are going to be common to all of these. So I talked a bit about IP in the product development agreement context. So licensing at the development stage, to make sure there are rights to access IP to do that joint development and then deal with what happens afterwards. Sometimes at the end of that development process, the net result is going to have been a fully formed technology, and one of the parties is going to end up with rights to then further commercialize. And so you might do a development agreement that has an accompanying license with it that covers the rights after the development is completed. And that license may give one of the parties the rights to do everything with it everywhere, or again, it may be split by field, or in the illustration Jeff had given, by geography. And always important here to think about licenses in a couple different ways. One of them is, I'll call sort of what people's first initial thought is, oh, I get a license, that means I get to use something. That can be true, depending on the kind of IP we're talking about. But often what a license gives you is a right to be free from being, from claims of infringement. And so it gives you some freedom to operate. And when we think about any of these agreements, we're thinking about both those issues as well. We also see licenses come up in some other kinds of arrangements where maybe the parties had collaborated for a while and things are not going to work out the way that BidCo thought, and it's ready to divest itself of the opportunity. I did that, tried it, just doesn't fit into the product portfolio anymore, so we're going to get rid of that product line. We worked on it together. The other company's better suited to take it. Sometimes that IP relationship is going to have been complicated enough that there aren't bright lines. So there's IP that's useful in this specific product line, but there might also be IP that's useful across other products. And in that case, there might be a residual license that we have to work through to cover both parties' rights to use the same IP, again, in different fields or different geographies. And there could be licenses in a supply relationship as well. So we've done the development and now we're doing distribution. There might be a sort of a fallback license that we cover in that context. The key with all of these and with all these situations, and if Jeff, you want to pop to the next slide, is making sure that we've got what I'd call sort of no surprises, certainty about what the IP is, no surprises in the, back one slide there, Jeff, more surprises in the IP, no surprises by lawsuits from other people. And so again, this comes back to the diligence. And Rona, we talked about this a little bit, but even just in this context of a simple license, maybe talk about the size of the team or the types of different resources that might be coming to the table at Medtronic or a similar sized company to take a look at issues that might come up in a license.
Yeah, sometimes it might be surprising, but when you're working with a big company, there's the business who's interested in the business deal, but then there are also all these ancillary functions, and each one's kind of like their own little lobbying committee or something like that that's looking at the issues they care about. So for tax, they're thinking about, okay, what entity should be the licensor or the licensee in this relationship, and what tax impact is that going to have? And if there's going to be a royalty stream, finance is going to care about who's receiving that royalty stream or paying it. And so they care about that, and they care about how the transaction is going to be accounted for. And, we talked a little bit about earlier whether or not it's going to be expensed on the budget or capitalized or some other thing. So those are like examples of functions that you think that has nothing to do with a license, but in a big company, everybody has an interest in it. The marketing team wants to know, okay, what products is this going to cover? What rights does it have? Who are the competitors who are out there? Is it going to allow us to sell to the parties, depending on the structure of the transaction? But down the road, is it going to allow us to sell to the customers that we want to with these rights? And who else is out there? The regulatory team is going to be thinking about, well, what indications do these products or will these products cover, and how does the IP relate to our regulatory pathway? And do they have the rights, that we're interested in? So I'm trying to think who else, and then, of course, the business has their own plan about when they think they're going to be able to commercialize, monetize, whatever. And so they're going to be thinking about how much life is left in the patent, and what this is going to get them that they don't have right now. And of course, the patent folks, the IP folks, are looking at all the things Anne is talking about of course, which is like the freedom to operate and what else is out there, and do the patents really cover the products and things like that. And so there's a lot of different stakeholders at the table who have different objectives, and sometimes, you know, it's hard to synthesize all of those priorities, but they're at least going to get a voice at the table in the diligence process and can have questions for you.
Yeah. And I would say in the negotiations as well, and sort of, you know, one tip I give to my, you know, my clients that are emerging or smaller companies is to, you know, at the beginning of this, any kind of collaboration with a larger entity, see if you can get a sense of what, you know, what is the size of the team on the other side? Who are the different stakeholders that need to weigh in, and when can you expect that to happen? Just, you know, understanding what the expectations are going to be, I think, can be really helpful as you move forward, and it can help, you know, eliminate some frustrations, and also make sure you've got your resources lined up. And, you know, this timing is taking that all into account. It also can be a good preview about how life might be as you work together long term, and it might help, you know, influence how you think about development or joint steering committee relationships and those sorts of things. So helpful to go in eyes wide open, and just, you know, have that conversation up front so you have an understanding of what to expect.
Yeah, I have two other notes about that. So one thing I wanted to mention is, this isn't to say that every large company expects that their partners are perfect or that they have no issues. I mean, everybody knows every company may have legal issues that come up, IP hurdles they have to get through. They may, in a regulatory environment, may have had a problem with a regulator they had to work through. And so that's expected, but how you disclose that to them, how you explain, you know, how you're dealing with that issue can be as important as the issue itself. So one of the things I would say is, if you're nervous about something, talk to your advisors early on about, okay, we have this potential claim or this product liability issue or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when is the appropriate time to disclose it? How much information should we share? And how do we explain this? Of course, being honest, but I think it will go a long way with the big company that you've thought about it and you have a story to tell that makes sense.
Agreed. Or a mitigation suggestion, right? So again, I think, you know, that first bullet about having certainty about access to IP and no surprises. I would say no surprises is a good watchword overall. There's, you know, if you're entering into a collaboration or relationship, be careful about having surprises come up that you know about partway down the road, because you'll just take a step back in that collaboration. And so if there's, you know, I think about it carefully, but being upfront and making sure things are disclosed early so you can deal with them together, and you're continuing to build that relationship of trust. Probably just a good watchword.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. I have had deals fall apart, not because the technology was necessarily an issue or the IP was necessarily an issue, but more because there wasn't trust between the parties, you know, or frankly, I mean, the little company may think working with a big company is a big pain in the butt, and they decide, no, we don't want to do this. We want to move faster, and we don't want to have to go through all this. It's not worth it to us. On the other hand, the big company may be like, they weren't really honest with us in the disclosure period. They were really antagonistic. I'm just making it up. But I've had deals fall apart where just the interaction in the diligence phase was so unpleasant that it quashed the deal. Yeah. So that's just a reminder that how you're not only being evaluated for, you know, the substance, but it's also to see, you know, how you're going to work together, because like Jeff said, these are living, breathing agreements, and you have to be partners. And if that's not possible, then it's not going to be a good relationship.
Yeah. Really good point. Good. Jeff, I think in the interest of time, the next two slides highlight some of the common areas that are important to bear in mind when you're working on a license in any of these collaboration contexts. So just a reminder that different kinds of IP bring different kinds of rights and things that you want to address in contract between patents or copyrights or trade secrets. And also that in all these situations, one of the key areas is going to be the scope of the rights granted. But yeah, I want to move to the topic number 3. Thanks. And that is really about focusing on who gets the benefit of the license. And some of the issues that come up there, not just identifying, as Rona mentioned, which entity within Medtronic, for instance, is going to be the licensee, and does it cover our affiliates or not? And there might be some implications there. But also, more specifically, when you get into these IP relationships, what about the ability to sublicense to other parties? And what happens if there are termination events? How does that impact those sublicenses? You'll see, especially in certain areas like drug discovery, sublicensing is much more typical. And so you may start off with a relationship with Big Co, and Big Co may want to say, but we may need to partner with somebody else who brings another active ingredient here. Or the way we do our distribution in Japan involves actually going through a sublicensee. So understanding that and talking about that is often quite typical, whether that's for development purposes or for distribution. And, Rona, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about how Medtronic approaches this and how important it is from a Medtronic perspective, as an example of a large co, in sort of identifying who they're going to be dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, we often get, when you're doing an acquisition, it's pretty straightforward that, one day, if the acquisition goes through, you're going to become the same team, and you don't have to worry about competitor issues as much. But when you're doing some of these interim or earlier stage agreements, the big company isn't sure if they want to buy you yet. The little company wants to keep their options open, and so there's a balance there. And for a big company, an example where this comes up is, let's say the big company is interested in doing development with a smaller company that has a certain expertise. The big company is interested in it for a certain field, for a certain indication, whatever their technology is. But the little company thinks, well, this could have other applications. And if you're not interested in those, I don't want to tie those up. So what you have to think about is, okay, if you're only getting an exclusive license in a certain field, then what happens if they go and license to other partners in other fields? And what if those are our competitors? And do we care? And from a practical perspective, like, what does that mean in the market if it's the same device, but different companies have rights to sell it in different fields? And then you get into sort of different issues about how it actually gets used. So sometimes it's a long process to think about, what rights you need now, what you might need in the future, and where the other company may go. If they end up getting acquired by someone else, and now we suddenly are in a licensing relationship with a competitor, are we comfortable with that? And what is that going to mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes we negotiate for that,
right.
A competitive situation, an ability to get out.
Yeah. I mean, Jeff mentioned some of the complications of, all of a sudden being in a relationship with a competitor around antitrust and things like that. But either of you, Aleda, feel free to jump in here too. What are some of the other considerations that a small company should understand a big company will be thinking about with this sort of fear, uncertainty about all of a sudden the transaction becomes one with a competitor because small co's had an investment or has been acquired?
Yeah. And we sometimes are on the flip side of that, right? So where we've licensed IP to the small co, and then all of a sudden the competitor has access to our IP, and that can be an issue,
right?
Not just to our confidential info, but now they've got information about our know-how and our processes, and that startup has had access to our employees. And it's hard for startup employees to take that and completely divorce it from any of the work that they've done from the startup. So then you've got a contamination issue that all of that is, your competitor now has access to all of it. And then I think on the dispute side, it also makes disputes more likely. If you have a competitor, they're going to want the scope of that license to be as broad as possible. And so there might be, issues there where they're claiming they've got more rights under that license than you want.
Great. Yeah. We also called out bankruptcy concerns, and I'll just, again, in the interest of time, we won't spend a lot of time thinking through why that is especially important in IP, just to say that it does add some uncertainty because there are some additional rights that come in, and it adds a lot of uncertainty if you're dealing with an international deal. And so highlights that importance of the financial diligence. But if we hop to the next slide, Jeff, I think, another topic that you just need to be prepared for and think through how this is going to play out in any kind of IP license collaboration standpoint is royalty related issues. And as we assume that most licenses are going to include some combination of patents and know-how, we often do need to treat the royalty provisions differently for those kinds of assets. Partly that's driven by some US law. And partly that's just driven by some, approach to what's valuable and what isn't. Rona, I don't know if there are some obvious themes that you've seen Big Co be concerned about when it comes to royalty provisions beyond the just how much are we paying? What's the size of the check?
Yeah, here? I mean, if there's an upfront payment, then there's just, a question of value and assessing, thinking about, is the payment commensurate with what we think we're going to get out of this? And of course, if it seems later on like we overpaid and there's competitors out there who are paying less, that is always, a hard pill to swallow. But also just thinking about what, I've seen issues where people really don't understand what patents cover what products, how the nets, if we're paying on net sales, how that's calculated. You may think, oh, this is going to be sold one way in the beginning, but later on, it turns out it's going to be a bundled product or it's going to be sold in a different way. Mm-hmm. And our agreement doesn't really address that. Or I've even seen issues where it's like, well, we pay on the product. Well, what's the product? Over time, the product has been iterated. There are different SKUs. And is that part of the calculation or not? And then just tracking that, again, in a big company, people turn over, departments turn over. There may be some tricks about how things were accounted for, how they track net sales and things in the past that don't get passed on. And so just keeping an eye on what you negotiated in your contract and how that actually evolves over time is something to be aware of. So that's
that's great. And on the flip side, that uncertainty about what the commercialization ends up looking like is really important for the for the newco, the emerging company, to think about, and again can be more complicated in certain areas, certain industries, but to the extent that there's a possibility that some other third party's IP is also going to be implicated, making sure you've thought through how that should impact the royalties. We call those stacking provisions. So if you're working on a drug or a drug device combo, and then you discover, oh, there really is somebody else who's got rights for this other component we need, this other active ingredient, this diagnostic that goes along with it, making sure that eventuality is built into the royalties is really important. So definitely an area of focus for certainty and flexibility at the same time, which can be tricky. And then finally, the other area that we spent a lot of time talking about, on to the next slide, Jeff, in any of the license context is how we're going to keep protecting the IP in the go forward. So, and I mentioned this before, but we decide up front and spend quite a bit of time talking through each party's rights to weigh in on patent prosecution and what jurisdictions we're going to look for coverage, what that's going to look like, and also allocating rights and responsibilities to both protect the IP defend challenges to the IP, but also pursue infringers. And so that can be the kind of negotiation that can be really frustrating and feel like we're talking about a lot of things that are future, but end up being important certainly from Big Co's perspective to have hammered out up front. In our slide deck, as we have with the other areas, we've given you a quick hit checklist. And so that just includes some of the key provisions that you want to make sure you're thinking about ahead of time that you should expect to show up in any kind of patent or technology license. And with that, I think we'll sort of continue along in our next illustration of a common collaboration agreement, becoming more common, and that's a data sharing agreement. And we are seeing this more and more often. Data is sort of everywhere, stating the obvious, but in all kinds of industries, we're seeing more unique collaborations that involve one party having access to a lot of data, whether that's data off a device or data out of electronic medical records or data that's been collected through operation of the business, and somebody else bringing technology to bear on that and developing something new. And I think I'll say from my practice, I've seen significant changes in where that comes up, again, across all kinds of industries over the past, 5, 10, 15 years. Aleda or Rona, either of you want to weigh in on that from your experience working with the world's biggest medical device company? How does it think about data?
Rona, you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, I agree with Anne that, and this is probably obvious, but of course, there's been more and more focus on data over the past several years as we realize a lot can be learned from the data, and maybe we weren't, in general, weren't taking advantage of all the value that it can bring. And partners are looking for creative ways to share data in a legal way, in ways that may enhance each other's businesses, and also in our field that enhance the patient experience. We have patients with, implanted devices or monitoring devices, and if that information could be used by their doctors to provide better care or to interact with their smartwatch or something else that helps them manage their own disease, that could be a great advantage, and also can help patient outcomes and help with preventative care too. So there's a lot of alignment in the healthcare industry that we should be working on those things and collaborating on those things to the extent we can. As I'm sure Anne's going to get into here, it's tricky because especially in the medical world, that information is private and highly sensitive and protected by a lot of laws. And so a company can't, even if their devices are collecting information, it doesn't necessarily mean they own it or they have the right to share it with others. And so that's always going to be a big issue to scrutinize and to think about. But in general, if you just even think about your own electronic medical records, for so long, I think we're always like, oh, why can't they just look in one chart? Why do I have to, have a different record with every doctor and they don't know what's going on with one practice versus the other? And so the patients want that. We all want that, but we're just trying to navigate how to do that legally and in a way that's fair for everyone.
Yeah, great. Jeff, if you pop to the next slide. Again, I promise not to lawyer geek out on this issue, but it's really one thing, again, that makes these kinds of collaborations involving data interesting is often you're dealing with people coming from two different worlds. So often there, again, is a kind of a legacy company that's used to robust product development and proof of concept and following a quality system. And you've got, on the other hand, maybe a more nimble startup who comes from the tech space and just has a different approach to the world. So you've got some cultural clash. And then you have an asset that's still kind of, we've got some uncertainty about how it's treated from a legal perspective. And so start with the first question, like, what is data? When lawyers are talking about data, what bucket do we even put it in to start categorizing and thinking about how rights flow? And data can fall under several different buckets of protection from a legal perspective. And it varies from country to country here as well. There can be trade secret in a database if the right kinds of things have been put in place as it's been developed and protected. So maybe it's a trade secret in how you've gathered data or what that data looks like. It's possible it's copyrightable. There's cases on this topic sort of on a regular basis, whether a database is unique enough that somebody actually has been creative in coming up with it, or is it just like the phone book, in which case it isn't copyrightable. There can be patents in data structures. That, again, has been an area of a lot of conversation, just like software patents here in the US over the past 10 years or so. So, big question about whether anything involving data can drive a patentable invention. And again, it's different in other countries. There are some other just sort of intangible rights that you might have in data. So early on in the early days of the internet, there was a lot of battling over, rights to data that might be accessed through a website. And some of the famous cases involve people trying to data scrape, take data off of websites. So somebody else has developed a big set of content and there's a lot of user data, and someone else comes and sweeps that up and tries to use that for their own purpose, or skips past the advertising pages to get right to the ticket listings, with sort of not getting the eyeballs on the page. And so those, sometimes those disputes get resolved under just general property right, kind of, sort of like you took something off someone's front lawn. But more often they end up being addressed by contract. And so there's been an evolving body of law about what you should put in a contract around data and what you need to do to restrict rights of data or allocate rights of data. And so clarity is really important up front and thinking about it. And then just the other nuance that's come along in the age of artificial intelligence is, so who is the inventor of something? If there's if there's AI running on data and there's a discovery through the AI, did a person invent something? Is there an invention if it was the software that did it itself? So, the bottom line is to try and avoid surprises, because none of us want to be part of a lawsuit that's helping set new law about how this all works. You're going to find this is an area that, Big Co is going to want to address thoroughly up front, and so should in Small Co as well want to do that. Next slide, Jeff. Rona, made a passing reference to sort of some of the issues that may come up in the complexity of dealing with data. And, Aleda, I don't know, I know you've only been at Medtronic for a few months, but you had experience with this before that as well. I think you'd say this is an area of big focus, sort of.
Yeah, to underscore the point on diligence, this is where we dig in pretty deeply. As Rona mentioned, there are pretty complex IP laws, pretty complex privacy laws that dictate how and why you can use this data and who owns it. And that's particularly true in healthcare. And so we'll really want to dig in and make sure that you can use the data in the way that you say you can use it, or that we need to use it. And there's a clear path to access it in the way that it needs to be accessed.
Yeah, great. So I think our next slide lists some of those laws and regulations that also need to be addressed. And I will say we've seen more than one transaction bite the dust early on. Somebody thought they had some great research data, some great early prospects to get into a new indication for a device, or they could have some application, and everybody's excited about an investment paired with some ongoing work together, and in diligence discover that the rights to get to the data in the first place just weren't appropriately covered. The right kind of consents weren't there, or the university still has broader rights. And so again, really important to think about these early on and make sure they're addressed, because it will be a big area of focus and can substantially affect the value or even whether a deal goes ahead. And think not just about the laws, but also contractual rights that may have been addressed to make sure those are covered. Other areas of focus on the next slide will just be the same that we've talked about before. Who's going to use it? Where can you use it? The difference, the other element with data is that you'll often also talk about data integrity. So making sure that you understand that the data continues to be secure from corruption. So not hacked, not disclosed. We always worry about that, but also not changed inappropriately. So that'll be another element of the conversation. We've got another quick hit checklist here to think about. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Jeff to talk about our fourth area.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about sales arrangements and, be mindful of time. And we're coming to the end of ours. I'll go through relatively quickly. Would love to take some questions from any of you. If you do have a question, feel free to type it in the chat box. And then we'll conclude and hopefully get everyone's questions answered. So the context for these, kind of two different, directions. The most classic example is a distributor agreement, where you have a product, it's fully developed. You've gone through all of the, development piece, the testing piece. If there's regulatory approval, you have a product ready to go. What you don't have is a sales force. Well, large companies have large global sales forces, including Medtronic. So the idea is really to leverage kind of that scale in selling your product. And then conversely, you could also have a situation where you might be a small company, but you might be in a kind of have a niche group of companies that a larger company is moving into. They might actually ask you to distribute their product, at least on a pilot basis, to sell their product that they've just developed into that new market as well. The types, distribution agreement. So that's where, the large company acquires your product, sells it, takes a margin, and there's a split of the sales proceeds or the net sales as a result of that product. A co-marketing agreement. This is an example where, let's say that you've developed, an app or an accessory product that can be used with a larger company's product. We're seeing, in the past year, we've seen some of this, for example, with, especially early in COVID when ventilators were getting a great deal of attention, smart software that makes ventilators work more effectively, or there could be an accessory product or a surgical tool that gets used with an implant. In that situation, you come together, you have an agreement that, as I'm selling your product or my own product, I'm going to also sell your product or market your product. The shipments will kind of come out of each company respectively, but we're sharing in kind of that lead generation and then the benefit of that as we go. The sales agent agreements they're similar to distribution agreements, except in a sales agent, it's really more of a kind of almost a commission relationship. And then supply agreements, we see this particularly on the OEM side, where it's just a purchase of a product, either as a component that gets incorporated into a broader product, or alternatively, it's simply, you've got the product that gets sold, gets branded for the other company, and then you supply it to the company and they sell it and they take responsibility for it. I'll kind of go through these pretty quickly and talk about some of just the highlights of things that we negotiate. Number one is exclusivity. A lot of times, if a company like Medtronic or other large companies want to sell your product, they're going to ask to be the only one who's selling it, at least within a given geography, so that they can focus on it and so they know that their competitor or you, as the company that developed the product, can't also sell the product. The exclusivity, can sometimes seem a little bit unfair, but Rona, kind of thinking about it from your perspective, this is something that you're going to want. Why is this okay for the small company to accept the exclusivity provision?
Well, I think it depends on the small company, but if you're in a position where you don't have the ability to sell into a particular market and the big company is going to bring all their resources or many of their resources to bear in that market, they're going to invest in the commercial launch of the product. They're going to train their people. They're going to translate marketing materials. They're going to do events, etc. That's ultimately to your benefit. Your product's going to get into the market, and they're going to be able to do it better than you can. And so, exclusivity may be a fair trade for you, depending on, again, what you are able to do yourself or through other distributors in that geography. One other way we sometimes bridge the gap on this is, if the big company wants exclusivity and the little company says, fine, but if you want exclusivity, then you have to buy a minimum amount for me every year, because otherwise it's not worth it to me. You're closing off that market, and I could be monetizing this more if I were selling directly or with other distributors. So sometimes we'll say, okay, we're exclusive and we'll agree to buy this minimum, but if we don't, then you can convert us to non-exclusive. And so that's a way to sort of balance both needs of, the big company not really wanting to have competitors in the market versus the little company wanting to get the benefit of the bargain and make sure it's worth the grant of exclusivity.
Kind of a close cousin of exclusivity is non-competition clauses. So this would be, a situation where, you are distributing a product, and, the large company says, hey, if I'm going to, or even as a small company, this is, maybe something that you want as well, where you have a relationship with a large company that's distributing your product, and what you push for is, hey, if I'm going to provide my product to you to distribute, this is something that I don't want you to sell my competitor's product. I want you to be focused on my product. This can be a big issue, particularly, if you're just starting out. Sometimes we see these phased, where, there's where the non-competition provision is either based on kind of expansion of geography, or it's only in certain geographies, or alternatively it's phased in over time, or tied to certain sales volumes. But this is something that we see fairly frequently, as well as being a kind of a fairly contentious issue to negotiate. Pricing, there's kind of simple and complex methods of pricing. A lot of times there will be a schedule of pricing per product, or alternatively you set a margin, where your costs, you calculate your costs, and then you get provided, a gross margin, for example, of 30% on a product. The price adjustments can also be very complicated. We see, various formulas that are tied to raw material cost, for example. I had one client that had, the entire cost of their product adjusted based on the raw material price of steel. And steel, was tripled in price earlier this year. Ended up being a untenable, cost relationship on their supply agreement. Sometimes it's tied to labor and materials, and sometimes it's tied to like some broader metric, like the consumer price index. In all of those situations, to the extent there's a pricing mechanism, the large company will also want information rights as it relates to the pricing mechanism, so that, if you as a small company are saying, hey, I used to pay, $20 an hour for my factory staff, and now I'm paying $25 an hour, the documentation and the diligence of that is really important, because the large company will demand information rights and want to make sure that they can verify that that's actually what happened. The other one is on minimum sales commitments. We see this a lot of times where the small company will say, if I'm giving you exclusivity, I want you as the large distributor of my product to, if I'm giving you my entire product line for a certain geography, I want a commitment that you're going to sell, X million dollars of product per year. It ends up being, kind of tightly negotiated because as a small company, it's very much a leap of faith, to believe that your product will sell well through the channel, or alternatively, that the large company will focus on it. Rona, can you talk a little bit more about this, like kind of, as you're thinking about minimums, like how do you think about new products in an untested market, and what does that look like, and kind of what gives you concerns from a large company perspective?
Well, you gave lots of the answers in the question, but thanks, Jeff. I mean, of course, the seller wants some certainty that a certain level of revenue is going to come in the door. The buyer wants to have certainty as much as possible and wants to lock in pricing. And I mean, typically, to be honest, well, it depends on the type of relationship we're talking about, but usually a big company is going to take on a distributor role versus a sales rep role, because we want to control the sales, control the customers, control the accounts. And basically, we will agree to purchase, in some cases, a minimum amount from the supplier in exchange for exclusivity, like we talked about before. But then after that, what we sell is to our customers is kind of our business. We are selling, those are our accounts, and it's kind of up to us to make that work or not. And, that's why we usually have some, let's say, a 3-year term and then a chance to renegotiate. And if the supplier thinks they could do better with a different distributor, then there will be a conversation about that. But in general, it's hard to always predict, like we said earlier, how well something's going to do in a market. And, one thing we'll try to do often is, if there are improvements to the products, get rights to that. Or if there are new products that the supplier comes up with, also see if we can get a right to add those to our bag as well. But to ensure that our sales are successful.
And then, kind of the last, main thing that we focus on as we negotiate these things, and, the lawyers and the business folks spend a great deal of time thinking about this. One is kind of, the warranties and the reps related to what the product looks like. This is really important in a regulatory environment. And then also what kind of the operational aspects look like, who's shipping it, on what timing, how do orders flow, is there a forecast, who's responsible for risk of loss, while items are in transit. So these are all things that, we end up, spending a good deal of time thinking about and negotiating. And it goes into kind of the overall economics of the transaction or the sales arrangement as well. So again, without going into a lot of detail here, this, all important terms, and kind of living, breathing terms as you execute on your agreement. Kind of, the last, spotlight issue, so force majeure, is really a kind of a not my fault provision in these agreements. And basically it means that if something happened outside of my control, I'm excused from performance under a contract. And you see these a lot in like supply agreements, like, hey, my factory burned down, I can't, send you your widgets because I don't have a factory anymore, or the government ordered me to, stop producing it. COVID, we've had kind of supply chain issues around the world, and so these force majeure provisions have come into a great deal of use this year, because pandemic is usually an excuse, or government order is an excuse for not performing under a contract. We're really out of time, but I mean, later, Rona, can you comment just on like Medtronic's overall supply chain, issues this year, and kind of what else have they done operationally to address any supply chain concerns this year?
Well, I'll say quickly, this, like Jeff said, this is a provision that most people didn't really focus on too much before, because it literally means extraordinary events and they usually don't happen. And so people were like, yeah, whatever, force majeure. But of course, this year we did have this, or the last couple of years, giant pandemic. And that got a lot of people looking at their contracts, you know, on the where we're talking about third-party suppliers or vendors. You know, we had lots of our suppliers saying, you know, we can't provide this in time because either, you know, our factory, there's a government order shutting down our factory, or we just can't get the raw materials, everything is delayed, or it's much more expensive for us to do this now. In the transportation realm, I've had the experience where with our transportation providers. On the other hand, where we're the supplier and we're selling to customers, we're looking at our contracts to say, like, is there anything in here that gives us relief if we can't provide because we're having these supply chain issues also? So I think people are looking at these, and, you know, if you don't have, depending if you're on the sell or buy side, you may want to include pandemic in your force majeure provisions going forward, or epidemic I see here, if you haven't already. From a practical perspective, though, I think most parties don't want to go to court to prove whether or not this was really a force majeure, and are trying to work this out reasonably. And, you know, if you really can't get the raw materials, then hopefully, you know, the customer will work with you, but also may want some assurances that you've put disaster recovery or alternate supply plans in place and have a plan to deal with those issues going forward, and may ask about that more now than they did before. And yeah, on the sell side, you also want to think about, okay, if this happens again, do we have a plan? You know, we can manufacture somewhere else, or is there anything we can do to relieve the circumstances for our customers?
Thanks, Rona. Again, we have a quick hit checklist if anybody wants a copy of the presentation. And then, you know, apologies for being a bit rushed at the end. I know there's a lot of detail that we had in our presentation, but I think the key takeaways, if there's three things we could leave with you, is, you know, number one, you know, large companies like Medtronic, you know, they're not just constantly acquiring early stage companies, you know, sometimes based on the technology or based on the relationship. One of these collaboration arrangements is just a better fit. And then these deals can also be advantageous for early stage companies if you structure them correctly. You know, the economics is important to pay attention to, and the value drivers, and also how you're allocating the risk between you and the large company. But they can, you know, speed your introduction of your product into a market, and they can also, you know, really be beneficial in getting you to a faster exit. And then the last point is hopefully that, you know, we helped you understand a large company's perspective, and it'll help you, you know, better equip you to strike the best deal with a large company going forward. So any questions, you know, thank you so much for listening. Any questions or follow-up, please feel free to direct them to Ann or me. Thank you.